Okay, I know this title seems unbelievable to some, but it's true. White Americans support welfare programs. They really do. But the catch is only if it's for themselves. So white Americans support welfare programs, but only for themselves, says the new research. Oh, wow. There's research that's done on this. Uh-oh. We're going to get in trouble here, huh? White Americans support welfare programs, but only for themselves. New study shows white Americans love government support programs. That's why they're here, the government programs. They wouldn't be here if they didn't use them for themselves, for their own benefits. That is, if they are the beneficiaries. Chauncey De Vega, August 1, 2018. Donald Trump's administration recently decided to give $12 billion to farmers hurt by the president's trade war against the European Union, China, and various other countries. These monies can be considered a form of welfare for white people in red states who are among his most loyal supporters. Moreover, the racial disparity is made even clearer by the way that the African American discrimination by the U.S. Department and the Justice Department reached a 1.25 or 1.25 billion settlement with Black farmers over. Wow, we're back at it again, right? So we have African Americans basically being discriminated once again, and you have a lawsuit. And so welfare for the white Americans is nothing new. Okay, so in many ways, the United States was built on white welfare. So whenever people say the welfare state, or they want to get rid of the gravy train, or they want to get rid of welfare programs, they really aren't saying that they want to get rid of all of these programs entirely. They just want to get rid of them for certain groups of folks. They don't want colored people participating in these programs and benefiting from it. They just want to benefit those, as in certain people who don't want to admit it, but white people who are Americans who benefit from these programs. As long as they can benefit from them, though, the programs can stay in effect. During the 18th and 19th centuries, free land was given to European settlers as the intended result of genocide and ethnic cleansing against Native Americans. So, as part of the same racist project, the stolen labor and lives of Black human property is estimated to have been worth trillions of dollars. So, in essence, Black pain and Black suffering was a de facto intergenerational welfare payment to white America. So, one that fueled the country's rise to global power and created income and other life opportunities for white people, both native born and immigrants. So, African Americans and other non whites were profited both by law and social convention from taking advantage of land grants and other opportunities made available by the Homestead Act and related 19th century legislation, which were conservatively worth hundreds of billions of dollars. So the American middle class, predominantly white by definition, was created after World War II by a way of federal programs like the VA and the FHA home programs and the GI Bill. So this example of white welfare was one of the largest welfare creations and intergenerational welfare transfer programs in history. So again, African Americans and other non-whites were, for the most part, denied access to those opportunities. So today, extreme racial wealth gap is the most obvious result of that. What economists and other social scientists describe as the submerged state. The government programs such as mortgage interest deductions, capital gains, and other tax credits and cuts and financial subsidies for entire industries is another example of white welfare. Just like the big tax break that the wealthy are going to get. So, moreover, the submerged state is a central means through which the welfare or racial welfare or racial wealth gap is maintained in so-called post-racial colorblind America. So there is a complication. So new research by Rob Wheeler, professor of sociology at Stanford University, and Rachel Wells, a researcher at the University of California, demonstrate despite all the ways that the government provided welfare programs to help them, white Americans are willing to cut such programs if they believe that African Americans and non-whites may benefit. So it's just like I said, they don't want people of color benefiting unless it's just them solely benefiting, them as in white Americans only. So this dynamic is made worse when white Americans are made to feel that their place at the top of America's social hierarchy is challenged. So Lyndon Johnson insight has been proven true over and over again. If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you. And so those are statements that they made back then to pretty much appease to poor white class of people so that they can further discriminate against people of, color. So a new academic article, Privilege on the Precipice, perceived racial status threats lead white Americans to oppose welfare programs. Okay. And so, published in May of 2018 issue, the journal Social Forces explores the issue, finding that white Americans' welfare attitudes are shaped by the concerns about the status of their racial group in American society. So we found that white Americans who saw a demographic report emphasizing that the decline of white majority tended thereafter to voice greater opposition to welfare. Okay, so, and this effect was partially mediated by increased racial resentment. Okay, so in our final study, we found that the information threatening the white economic advantage resulted in increasing opposition to welfare programs when whites perceived those programs to primarily benefit minority people, but did not affect support for the programs portrayed as benefiting whites. So these findings implicate racial status threats as a causal factor shaping whites' opposition to welfare. So Wetz and Wheeler concluded that the pessimistic but realistic observations about how white racial resentment and white racial racism hurts America or Americans on both sides of the color line, and how efforts to create racial equality will continue to spur white backlash as they have throughout American history. So any progress towards equality may provoke resentment on the part of the dominant class or dominant members who may react politically in ways that undermine or even reverse progress to racial equality. And so in the case of American social welfare programs, this further implies that evidence of increased racial equality could exacerbate overall economic inequality. So as whites attempt to undermine racial progress, they see as in threatening their group status. They increase opposition to programs intended to benefit poor members of all racial groups. Okay. So I recently spoke to Rachel Wetz about the team's research on white racial resentment, racism, Trumpism, and social safety nets. This conversation has been edited for clarity and length. So the discourse around poverty, welfare, and deserving and underserving poor in the United States is highly racialized. So it is also gendered. Okay, so how do these dynamics play out as present? Rob Wheeler and I examine the sources of white America's opposition to welfare. And so we find evidence that welfare backlash among white Americans is driven in part by feelings that the status of whites in America is under threat, rightfully so. Um, these threats trigger heightened levels of racial resentment among whites and in turn heighten opposition to welfare programs that whites tend to perceive as mostly benefiting racial minorities. So this research shows us when and why whites support cuts to social safety net programs that benefit poor members of all racial groups, while we don't directly look at the processes that lead whites to perceive welfare programs as primarily benefiting minorities rather than whites. Other research discusses how these programs become racialized. So, for example, through the media depictions that disproportionately portray welfare recipients as being Black people, see work by Martin Gillens through racialized rhetoric of political elites that connects these policies to negative stereotypes of minorities. Example, Tali Mendelberg or Ian Haney Lopez work on dog whistle politics. Okay. So white Americans on average have much higher incomes, wealth, and representation in the government than African Americans, Latinos, and other non-white groups. So given those facts, why would white fear the racial group is losing a status quo? So that's because of being greedy. You're worrying about protecting your wealth constantly. And when you don't want others to achieve anything or others to get where you are, and then eventually, if you hear things about your culture is starting to, you know, either be attacked by the opioid crisis, or if you're hearing numbers of people in your culture are not as big as they used to be in the beginning, like in the 50s and 60s, and that, you know, that there's more equality happening, and then you start seeing people of different backgrounds starting to get along, that threatens your whole ideology and what you always stood on. You feel threatened. And then when you see a lot of people speaking out on issues of inequality and wealth, racial wealth gap, and when you hear topics like you know, racial profiling and anything having to do with issues like that, you fear that now all of the ideologies and the beliefs and the things that your culture usually stood on as a ways of to serve as a protection to keep you at that top hierarchy is threatened. And so while whites continue to enjoy many of the historical privileges in the country, much public discourse about race, particularly in the period immediately following the election of Barack Obama, emphasized America's increasing demographic diversity and declining dominance of white people in the country. And so most prominently, after Obama's election, political commentators were announcing the arrival of the post-racial era. And so they don't want that. You got to bring back the old ball and chain. We got to make America great again. But within there, really what they want to say, we want to make America white again. That's what they really want to say. So in addition, many of the others also highlighted the role of the non-whites in the Obama election. So while it's true that whites on average continue to have political and economic advantage relatively to African Americans and Latinos, that these larger social trends and high profile events can create the sense that these advantages are potentially precarious or slipping away. So perceptions don't always match reality. These members of the media and politicians sometimes frame and highlight social trends and events in ways that might make them seem more threatening to whites' status than they actually are. So, for example, research finds that people in many countries, including the US, strongly overestimate what percentage of the population is made up of immigrants and what types of perceived threats by whites Americans to their status do you examine in your research. And so we find that the variety of forms of the perceived threats to the standing of whites in America lead them to withdraw support for welfare programs. So these include perceived threats to whites' political power, majority status quo, and economic advantage. For example, we find that whites' racial resentment rose in 2008, the same year that the Great Recession and the election of Barack Obama, suggesting that the perceptions of increased political power among minorities were leading whites to a sense of a threat to their group status. So, in another study, and that's why we have who we have as president now. That's why some whites elected Donald Trump, because they wanted presidents to be white again. They wanted them to be male, and they didn't like Barack Obama because he was black and he represented a new era. And that was some of the reason why. So in another study, we found that when whites saw a threat to their economic advantage over minorities, they were more likely to want to cut the social safety net programs, but only if those programs portrayed are primarily benefiting minorities, not if they were portrayed as benefiting the white people. So this can help us understand the current wave of welfare backlash, which paradoxically began in the midst of the Great Recession. So typically you expect that the research typically finds that Americans are more supportive of government aid to the poor during the economic recessions, but economic downturns can also amplify racial threat effects. And this recession coincides with the election of the first black president, that is. So we present evidence consistent with the theory that this led whites to feel that their racial status was being threatened. And this helps explain the rising opposition to welfare programs in the recent years. So what can this research tell about the current political moment? So first, the Trump administration has recently made several moves to cut the society safety nets, such as cutting housing subsidies, proposing work requirements to receive food stamps. And now he wants you to have photo ID and show that you're a citizen. So I'm adding that in there. That's something new. So if you didn't know that, he might, in the near future, you might have to show your ID to get groceries. That's so they can prove that you're a US citizen. So in this context, it's important to understand the dynamics that drive welfare backlash. This research suggests that the white voters may be supportive of measures of the rollback safety net programs, even when these programs could benefit them, as a response to feeling the threatened racial status and racial resentment. Second, there's been a lot of talk recently about the role of racial threat in shaping the current American political environment. So we wanted to test some of these speculations with research. Okay, so we signaled to a welfare backlash from white conservatives during the Obama years. And so the Trump election was a type of white backlash as well. And if you didn't know that, you should know it. So how do these two dynamics interact? There were many factors that contributed to the Trump's election, but there's one in particular that our work can speak to: white racial resentment, of course. While we don't directly look at Trump support in our research, we conducted these studies before his presidential campaign, and his election was part of the historical moment where we find heightened racial resentment among whites, which we argue results from a sense that the status of whites in America is under threat. So other research, such as the new paper by Diana Mutz, ties these feelings of resentment and the status loss among whites to support Donald Trump. So what kind of broader social changes might create these sense of threatened statuses, leading to the heightened racial resentment among whites? In the new paper, we argue that the historical period beginning in 2008 and leading up to Trump's election saw a series of economic and political events that we likely to be perceived as threats to whites' positions in the racial status hierarchy. So the election of the first non-white president, a high-profile event with a lot of symbolic significance for signaling changing relationships between racial groups. The political power of the steadily growing minority population in the US, which was felt in 2008 and 2012 elections to a greater extent than ever before, and highlighted by political commentators. The Great Recession was number 3. And so past work finds that the economic downturns can exacerbate racial threats by giving whites the sense that they may lose out on more limited economic resources. So we argue that the feeling of threat of whites' experience resulting from Obama's election increased silence or salience of the declining white population were likely amplified because they occurred at this time of a national economic insecurity. And so while our research can't directly speak to the sources of Trump's support, it does examine that the kinds of social trends can increase whites' racial resentment, which other research increasingly shows is tied to support of Trump. And so I'm going to stop for a minute and then I'm going to keep reading. So there are most people that I've seen who, there's some white people that I know who did vote for Trump. And they're not saying this, but some of the things that they do in their actions and some of the wild comments that they've made, and I'm not going to repeat them, point directly to this article of why they voted for Trump. So in particular, I'm going to go on. There's been a lot of talk about whether people supported Trump because of racial resentment or because of a sense of being left behind economically. It's been both, from what I've heard from people who are white. It's been both. Again, we can't speak directly to the question of Trump support, but we argue here, based on previous research, that the feelings of the larger economic decline and the societal level can exacerbate racial threats, and these feelings of threat increase white racial resentment. So rather than seeing economic hardship as the alternative reason some whites might support Donald Trump, our research would suggest that the national economic decline was a factor contributing to whites' heightened racial resentment during the historical moment leading up to Trump's election. So reading your article, I kept thinking about these ongoing debates and this sophistication, rationality, and the American electorate. Considering your feelings, is this further proof that the white racial animus and the psychological wages of whiteness lead white voters to act irrationally? Or could it be that many white Americans are simply using a different calculus that goes beyond basic material self-interest and making political decisions? So the part of our work that speaks most closely to this is our finding that white racial resentment rose in the midst of the Great Recession, leading to them to increase opposition and welfare relatively to minorities, are related to minorities' level of welfare support. And so research finds that publics typically respond to economic crisis rationally. Okay, so the increased support of the government action to reduce economic insecurity. In our paper, we find that minorities showed this frequently observed increase in welfare support in 2008. So at the onset of the major economic downturn, but whites did not. So this pattern can be understood as an across the board increase in welfare support in response to economic crisis being offset among whites by their response to racial status threat. So our paper suggests, as you say, that the answer isn't simple, Our paper suggests that both a rational and response to economic downturn and heightened racial resentment affected whites' support of race, what they would call a coin as a racialized welfare programs during the Great Recession, leading to a heightened racial divergence in whites and minorities' attitudes toward welfare. So, okay, and so there's other things that are leading up to this. You know, why are food stamps under attack? And well, that's something totally different. But this article pretty much lays everything out about the resentment and why he's got a lot of support from white, not only white Republicans. There's been white people who are, you know, they might be middle of the road on issues. And it's not just whites. There's some black people who are middle of the road on issues as well. And so, but their take on it may not necessarily be of that of a racialized resentment. They might be looking at it more in terms of economic stability. They are looking at it in terms of that Donald Trump is going to, you know, change the economy and it's going to be better for blacks economically. And so you have these people who call themselves free thinkers, or they're thinking outside the box, as they would say. But what they don't realize is that there's a number of people who voted for Trump simply because he's white, and they fear that the changing demographics is a threat to their racial hierarchy in this country. There's always been held to be white, a WASP, Western society, which is a Western Anglo-Saxon Protestant, or at least belief, ideology, which is more historically so, or at least white American ideology. And so, what are your thoughts and your feedback on this? This is something that isn't really new, and it's something to think about. You know, people are not really sure where this country is going to go, you know, because it seems like there's a heightened racialized controversy, and there's like a what you call I call it, it doesn't involve rocket launchers and guns, and that's well, there are guns involved in it when it comes to police and stand your ground laws, but there's like a slow burning civil war and unrest in this country, and it's always been there, and it's never been resolved. And so it's like a seething anger, and every now and then it boils over, and then you'll have like a protest here, a protest there, a riot here, right there, and it goes from generation to generation to generation over issues like this, and a lot of it points back to people who are greedy and they want to stay on top and in power. And so they basically use, you know, certain divisions to put people on the lower end. If they have to use your education or your skin color or where you were born or your nationality of whatever, or whatever you call yourself, they'll do it as long as it keeps money in their pockets. If they can benefit from programs for themselves, they can stay on top. If they can be looked at as the higher class or the highest in the social hierarchy of dominance in the country, then so be it. And so this pretty much spells it out. So what are your thoughts on this issue? But this is something that's not new. This pretty much really validates all of the things that you see in the news today when you hear people upset over issues having to be discriminated because they can't sell a bottled water, a little girl trying to sell bottled water on the street, and a little boy, he was trying to cut somebody's lawn so he can make a little bit of change. And black people have had the police called on them, and famous black people have had the police called on them for coming to their own house, and they were looked at as criminals. They're breaking in there. How can you break in your own house? We've had Black people who try to use a coupon. They got out of a magazine and had the police called on them. So we know what we've been knowing this is out there. We know what time it is. And so, get discriminated on jobs, you get discriminated in school. Now we have people who they may not be in the Black culture per se, but now they're being discriminated because they can't go to certain, school institutions. Well, they might be doing you more good, people, and they're discriminating Asian students, because they don't want too many people that aren't white going to the high prestigious colleges and actually earning a degree the right way without getting in with legacy, recruitment. And so these are the things that we're seeing, in real time now. And you have the poor whites who, if they're married to somebody Black, or if they're in a disagreement with this, you're ostracized, but they want to boast to you that, if you come on over to the other side, you have our skin color, that you'll benefit from these programs too, but you got to step on the neck of those who don't look like you. And so we know what's going on. And so we see all these killings, and they're using the law and twisting the law so that it can benefit their agendas. And so this is what time it is. So yeah, that is a civil war. It's another type of war. It's a sort of like a silent seething war that is just brewing. And every now and then you have these little sparks that ignite, because you have a protest here and then you have a riot there, and then it dies down, and then they bring out more programs to try to quiet people down for a couple of months. And then when those things dry up and the money dries up, they're back at it again. And so that's what we've been seeing decade after decade after decade. And then when you see people that seem like they're getting a little ahead in life, then they got to bring something else in to knock you back down. And so, what are your thoughts and your feedback on this? It's not something that we haven't been all too familiar with. I'm going to let this video go, but this is out of the salon. And so you see the title for yourself. If you want to read it, this is where it came from. Thanks for listening.